Welcome to the Free Library of Philadelphia. My name is Jason Freeman. I'm a producer and editor here in the Author Events Office, and I'm so pleased to be here to introduce Victor LaValle, Justina Ireland, Sam J. Miller, and Alice Sola Kim. So what is A People's Future of the United States? The two co-editors of this anthology challenged some of America's most talented writers to offer visions of what they thought the landscape of this country might look like on down the line. They also, according to the book jacket, asked for the stories to be badass. What we've ended up with in this collection are variously hopeful, cynical, dystopian, utopian, complicated, messy, thrilling, prophetic views of our shared future. In spending some time pondering why such oracular pursuits are so necessary, I thought of a T.S. Eliot quote that I love, which ends with the line, And the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and to know the place for the first time. Co-editor Victor LaValle is the author of 4 novels, 2 novellas, and a collection of short stories. Many of these works have been named to slews of Best of the Year lists by such venerable publications as the New York Times and the Washington Post. He has been the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, an American Book Award, and the Shirley Jackson Award, among other honors. To the 3 authors featured in this anthology who are with us tonight. By her own admission, Justina Ireland writes books about dangerous girls. She is the author of the New York Times bestselling Dread Nation, as well as Vengeance Bound and Promise of Shadows. In researching the writing of your programs and this introduction, it would appear that she was the only guest to have lived here in Pennsylvania, but I could be wrong. The other 3 currently live in New York, but we promise not to hold that against them. Speaking of which, Sam J. Miller up next. His debut novel, The Art of Starving, was one of NPR's best books of 2017, and last year he published the adult novel Blackfish City. He is the winner of the Shirley Jackson Award, and his stories have been nominated for the Nebula and World Fantasy Awards, and have also been regularly anthologized in Year's Best collections. And Alice Sola Kim, the winner of the 2016 Writing Award. Her writing has appeared in such diverse and esteemed publications as McSweeney's, The Village Voice, Strange Horizons, and Tin House. She has also received grants and scholarships from such enviable institutions as the McDowell Colony, Breadloaf Writers Conference, and the Elizabeth George Foundation. So let's get back to the future, ladies and gentlemen, as you join me in welcoming these folks to the Free Library of Philadelphia.
Hello, everybody. I want to thank you all for coming. My name is Victor LaValle, and I'm one of the co-editors of the anthology. I want to thank you all so much for coming out on an especially, what seems to us, especially gloomy and rainy sort of night. It really means a lot to see you all here. Just to give you a general idea of how we'll handle the evening, each of our authors are going to read just a few pages from their stories to give you a sense of what those stories are like. And then we'll sit down and I'll ask them some questions and we'll get some amazing and riveting answers from them about those questions and just have a conversation together. And after that part is done, we'll switch to a Q&A where we'd love to hear from you, your thoughts, your questions about what we've discussed, yes? So with no further ado, I'm going to ask Alice Sola Kim if she would go up and read for us.
My story is titled Now Wait for This Week, and I am going to read from a weird section in the middle. It begins, "The time Bonnie brought me breakfast." One morning, Bonnie knocked twice on my bedroom door and came in without waiting for a response. I didn't like her coming into my room because she often gazed at my furniture, my clothes, my shoes, with a fixed, sweetly neutral expression that I knew was pitying and insulting. Sure, my things weren't nearly as nice as Bonnie's, but I also didn't think they were so bad you needed a poker face to look at them. This time, she didn't do any of that. She said, "Call in sick to work. I want to show you something." You know I can't. Although, did she know? Currently, I had a pretty good temp gig at a duty-free shopping company, entering the names of makeup products from large binders into a computer database. Near the end of my stint, they discovered I had entered all the names incorrectly because I had been trained incorrectly. So they hired me for another round to fix the mistakes I had made, which was really nice and humane and understanding of them. Unfortunately, because I'd finally been doing my job right, I would be losing it soon. I had no idea what was happening next. "It doesn't matter," Bonnie said. "Okay, no, wait. I'll pay you 5 times what you usually make in a day. And I'll buy you breakfast. Let's go out." "Seriously?" She looked down at me with the hauteur of a much older, much more professionally accomplished woman. "You know that I never lie about money or food." She placed an already written check on my face, and when I started sputtering, she said she'd go wait in the living room. After I got ready and called in sick, I came out and found Bonnie sitting primly on the couch, her eyes closed. "Let's go," she said, standing. Her eyes were still closed. Now that I was next to her, I saw her lids were covered in something clear and crusty. "You're about to ask what's up with my eyes. I superglued them shut," she said. "Is it dry?" she asked herself. "Yes, it's dry. So you can see that my eyes are completely closed, right?" Oh, were they ever. I was backing away very stealthily when Bonnie said, "Stop backing away, not that stealthily. I know you have this whole thing about being allergic to crazy because of your schizophrenic aunt who raised you, and it's fine to honor the child who had to come up with coping mechanisms and protect herself somehow, but you've got to get over it. Sometimes shit is wild beyond all reckoning. Sometimes people are extremely weird and oftentimes literally crazy, but they're not all the time trying to be crazy at you. So get over it. Oh, and you're not so normal yourself." She put on a pair of black sunglasses. "Look, you're going to say, says the rich white hot girl with the happy childhood, which is not wrong, although you did meet my parents. Oh shit, wait, you didn't this time. Anyway, you're right, but I'm still right about a tiny bit of it too. Do you want to come get your mind blown or not?" "I wasn't going to say hot," I said. We left for so long I forgot to ask how she knew about my aunt. Then we went out. Though she couldn't see at all with her eyes glued shut, Bonnie didn't need my help out of the building. She picked up a toy that had fallen from a stroller and gave it back to the child. She complimented a woman on her shoes in convincing detail. She bought a newspaper and told me what was in it. She took out her phone and told me what everyone was talking about. She stood on the street corner and asked me to let her know when it was exactly 8 a.m. And when it was, she pointed straight ahead and said, "Red car, blue car, cop car, hot guy on a bike, hot guy jaywalking." Though I disagreed about the hotness of the guys, if you took Bonnie's tastes into account, this was all accurate. And all with their eyes super glued shut. I checked them again. They looked even more awful in daylight. "Bonnie," I said, feeling equal parts wonder and foreboding, "how are you doing this?" I'll stop there. Thank you.
I'm going to read you the beginning of my story, which is called "It Was Saturday Night, I Guess That Makes It All Right." Wanting Sid was a second skeleton, a sharp, hard, permanent feeling foreign presence in my body. Stupid to have fallen in love with yet another straight boy, especially one I worked with, and therefore couldn't play my only straight boy conquest card, which was to get us both super drunk and make a pass and ignore the person forever if it failed. We drove the 6 hours to Albany, and I felt it growing inside me, the need making my throat hurt, my limbs heavy, our windows rolled up as we passed through patches of wet weather, the smell of him filling up the cab of the truck as the day got hotter. And at the end of it all was Albany, which meant no relief, just the god-awful sunset lonely feel of a big sprawling nothing city, smelling like river muck and tar and cherry-flavored cigarette smoke. We came to a stop in the shadow of those tall, fancy, empty buildings that fill up state capitals, where municipal employees once worked before their tasks got sourced to bots and freelancers. They made me shiver, the shadows they cast and the wind that whistled through them after being in that hot, man-stinking truck for so long. "You're welcome," he said when he put the big truck in park. "I timed this expertly. Got us in late enough that we can't start working, but early enough that we get some time to relax." Sid's not a handsome guy, but something about his deep voice and ancient baseball cap and sad, easy laugh made me lose my fucking mind. He's only 5 years older than me, but somewhere in those 5 years he got a surveillance engineering degree, one of the first classes to graduate with it, and that's why he was my supervisor, driving us all over upstate New York to install phone cloners on every corner. Our truck held 900 of them. "You hungry?" he asked. "I could go for a burger." "No, I need to stretch my legs. Gonna go for a walk." "Cool," he said. "Call me if you want to meet up after." Men watched us from sagging plastic seats at the edge of the parking lot, sour-faced in that way only the unemployed or the forcibly freelanced were. "We should turn in around 10, he said. "Sure." At night, we sleep in the truck. Company rules. Privatized police forces didn't want any unnecessary hotel expenses. The back of the cab had a space for sleeping. Long after midnight, I'd wake up to find that he'd scooched his sleeping bag closer to mine and had spooned in behind me. It'd be the same way when the nights were hot and we both slept above the sleeping bags, but that was much worse, because then I could feel his hard-on pressing against my backside, and he'd whimper sweetly in his sleep, and I would know for certain that the universe was a cruel and vicious fucking thing, mocking me with a nightmare pastiche of what I wanted most. So, of course I had to stretch my legs. Of course I had to get as far from Sid as possible. Of course I had to find a safe sexual outlet, even if there was really no such thing. My phone stutter sighed, visual overlay alerts. They were everywhere, built by braver souls than me, elaborate digital landscapes that brought forward buried history or highlighted secret spaces. I knew all about them, maps of the homes of militia leaders, queer cruising grounds, memorials for martyrs we were forbidden to mourn or even mention, how to find everything I wanted from this world, but I was too afraid to use the overlays. Most people who accessed them did a factory reboot immediately, but some municipal networks were programmed to respond to reboots by doing a quick clone cap and sending it to the grid. I walked beneath the southbound exit ramp of I-787, splotches of paint where tag drones had covered up graffiti. I could still smell the turpentine stink of that toxic background matching paint. Most were unrecognizable, but one looked like the outline of some massive vertical corpse. They left other glyphs, equally illegible but politically more palatable to the good people of Albany. The black cross superimposed over a red R, emblem of the revival, ominous 88s, visual overlays for my enemies.
The worst thing about reading after other people is you get really into listening to them read, and then you're like, oh, now I have to go do this. So, this is from my short story, which is called Calendar Girls. Alyssa posted up on her corner and watched the late afternoon foot traffic with feigned disinterest. Friday was her busiest day. Saturday was decent, no doubt, but Friday was lit. Folks were still full of hope that they could somehow fix their busted-ass week by getting lucky. TGIF and all that shit. By Saturday, most folks had a hangover and were broke. Unless you wanted a bunch of ankle biters, smashing cakes cost a lot of money. So Friday, that was Alyssa's best day. Everyone liked to be prepared for the weekend. Whether it was textiles or monthlies or squish, Alyssa had it. She'd owned this corner since the Devora sisters went down a couple months back, and she'd been making bank. People in the financial district liked to fuck, but not a single of them wanted a baby. Alyssa's greatest asset was that she was pretty. That made her approachable, and it had kept her in business safe and booming even though she was slight and young. She wasn't like the sisters, who'd successfully held onto their turf through brute force. Alyssa knew to give the cops their cut and to dress nicely enough that no one suspected she was anything other than some schoolgirl waiting for the uptown bus. Her hair was neat, her skin was moisturized, and she smiled at strangers, and she always helped the older women on and off the bus. A man in a pricey suit wearing a fedora paused to tie his shoe near Alyssa, dropping a $100 bill as he did so. "Textiles?" he muttered, his eyes skidding left and right. Alyssa grinned and languidly bent over to pick up the money, the beads on the ends of her cornrows clacking together as she did so. These hedge fund bros had no fucking chill. "My man," she said, picking up the cash and depositing the condoms in the man's waiting palm in a single smooth move. "Don't use them all in one place." The man gave her a single panicked glance before he scurried off. When the siren whooped, Alyssa knew why he'd been so nervous. She'd been set up. "Hands up," the cop said, vaulting out of the car and drawing down on her, like she was one of those Christian terrorist cells instead of a slight teenage black girl wearing a high school uniform. "What's going on, officer?" Alyssa asked, widening her eyes and holding up her hands. She'd already dropped her bag and kicked it over toward the wizened old woman on a nearby bus bench. It was only possession if they caught you holding. She recognized the officer who grabbed her hands, spinning her around as he cuffed her. "Damn, Finley, if you wanted a bigger cut, you should have just said so." "It's out of my hands, Liz. I'm sorry," he said, running his hands over her body in a way that was perfunctory, not perverted. She appreciated the small mercy. This wasn't her first arrest, but at least this one wouldn't leave her feeling like garbage. He plucked her cell phone out of her sweatshirt and pocketed it, along with a couple of packs of monthlies and a handful of shiny foil textile packets. And then she was hustled to the back of a police car. No rights read, no identichip scanned. The other officer just watched her through narrow eyes as Finley put her in the back of the car. Damned harpies, he spat. As the car pulled away, a small Asian girl ran up to grab Alyssa's bag, taking up the spot that she had just vacated. Alyssa couldn't help but tilt back her head and laugh. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for those readings. Before we dive into our conversation about the anthology, I did also want to let you all know that backstage we'd bet on how many people would actually be in this room. I apologize, I lost my voice yesterday, so it's going to be in and out. But we were saying less than 5, and it would be a bad night. 10, and we would consider it a smash success. So you all have far outstripped our wildest dreams, and we are so grateful for you for doing that. Yeah, okay. So what I wanted to do was just to read to you all very quickly. So as I said, I'm one of the co-editors of this anthology, along with an editor named John Joseph Adams. And to give a sort of sense of what the overall sort of mission or idea of this anthology was, I wanted to read just a version of what we sent to each of the writers in the hopes that it would pique their interest enough to make them want to be involved. So what we said here is, with each day, the news sounds more like the plot from a work of dystopian fiction than current events in the United States of America. And yet the narratives to our conversation about the anthology, God dang it, I totally messed this up. Let me try this again. I think I cut and pasted what I wrote to you all in the email in the middle of this thing. Let's jump to what we're witnessing depicts a dystopian world where many Americans are disposed of, imprisoned, assaulted, and killed. In this moment, we are asking writers to seriously consider what it would mean and to speculate how to reclaim the future of our country. Thus, we are publishing A People's Future of the United States, a collection of 20 to 30 visionary speculative fiction stories that will show us the future through the eyes of those whose lives have been threatened throughout American history. People of color, women, immigrants, Muslims, and other persecuted religious groups, disabled people, queer and trans people. We are seeking stories that explore new forms of freedom, love, and justice, narratives that release us from the chokehold of the history and mythology of the past, and writing that gives us new futures to believe in. We invite all kinds of stories. The structure, characters, plots, and forms are all up to you. We hope you'll bring your unique style and voice to these stories. So I just wanted to read that to you so you get an idea of like what we were sort of asking of the writers who agreed to send stories to us. And I guess to begin the conversation, I would love to know when we sent that out to you, when you got that sort of prompt or invitation, how or why did that lead to the story that you ended up, that we ended up being lucky enough to publish in the anthology? Anyone can jump in. Politeness is not necessary.
Well, I read that email. I was like, hells yeah, this is my jam. Because I like fucking shit up as much as the next person. But mostly, I think it's when you're in a point of despair. And I personally have been in a deep despair since 2016 because the country is flawed. I knew America was flawed. I did not know it was this deeply flawed. And so it's kind of like when your kindergarten teacher gets like busted on like drug possession, you're like, oh my God, Mr. Carter's selling crack. Like, it's like that deep kind of feeling of disappointment and like sadness all kind of wrapped up together. So when I saw this prompt, it was really kind of gave me like a light in the darkness because it gave me a way to write through that despair into something that was, more hopeful and resistant.
I'm going to be really real here, if I can, and I think I can.
The realist.
I got 3 invitations to anthologies that were similar, that were also about like resistance and, is there hope for the country and speculative futures within the space of a couple of months. This was the one that blew me away. And the one that I thought, oh yeah, no, that sounds amazing. I'm a community organizer. I've used the Howard Zinn text, A People's History of the United States, in, sort of like in training folks in how to tell their stories and how to represent the issues that they're dealing with that they want to fight to fix. And I've always been a fan of that sort of approach of, the real history is the history of the people who've been fucked over by whatever the history is. So the title and the editors hooked me. So that's where my story came from.
When I got this invitation, I was super excited. I was like, wow, like everyone else has been saying, like what it's about, the sort of spirit of the email, and the, editors and the other people who are already already involved. And I was like, yes, I'll do it. And then I realized, I really want to read this, but I actually have no idea what to write. This was like a very hard story to get done for this anthology. And I think it was because of how I was feeling, the mood I was in, and that everyone else seemed to be in as well. Like, to find hope from that and to make something that I was proud of and considered good fiction felt really hard to me. Every time I tried to write something hopeful, it just felt like, I don't know, lying and bland, and not. It felt like it didn't come from anything I was seeing or experiencing or involved in. I kept working at it, and a tip I think another writer gave me about this is also real, a little bit real, about submitting a story based on like a prompt, right, or on a certain theme. They're just like, you don't have to follow the prompt. Just don't do it after a while, and then it'll work itself out eventually, or everyone else will like twist it into that shape for you. That's not what I did, but it was helpful. It kind of relaxed me a little, and I think, eventually, because I was relaxed that way, I was able to kind of find my way into the subject matter, and even find my way toward kind of writing hope.
Well, to that end, all three of you, I feel like obviously I don't want to ruin any of their stories or any of the other stories in the book, but I feel like one of the things that's fascinating about all three of your stories is the ways that I feel like I wonder if we could talk a little bit about the difference between, say, hope and happy endings, right? And I mean, it seems obvious on one level what the difference between those two things are. But I wonder, as writers, as accomplished as you are, how you thread the needle between those two sort of places. Or I guess between hopelessness, hope, and happy endings. How do you find where you sort of landed by the end? Because I wouldn't say any of them come to a place that's easy, but I certainly don't feel like you come to a place where you just go, oh, what's the point? Which is kind of amazing considering what you've all said about the feelings you were having. So how'd you do it?
For this story in particular? Or?
I mean, or life in general. I mean, it would be great. But for this story, certainly I want to limit the demands I'm making of this question.
I would say I write YA, and YA is always about that tendril of possibility weaving its way through even the darkest night, which is one of the reasons I do find sometimes writing YA. So I think sometimes YA gets kind of short shrift because people see it as simplistic and like, oh yeah, everything's going to turn out all right in the end. But it's also about that hope. And for me, I realized as I was writing the story that when your resistance isn't necessarily success, sometimes success is just surviving another day to keep fighting. And I know a few weeks ago people were talking about this idea of hope punk. Then the idea of hope punk was everything's hopeful and the point of the fight is the fight. And I feel like that's not hope punk. I feel like that's hopeless punk, because it's that sounds exhausting. If you've ever been in a fight, at some point you need to lay down your weapons and take a break. Otherwise, you become broken. So when I was writing this story, I tried to think
I was in this very dark place. This was like the first thing I had written after the 2016 election. In fact, my YA novel that was due at the time was so very late because I was in that place you're talking about, like, how do I create in this dystopian future I now live in? There are no hot guys here. It's a YA joke. And so, like, that was one of the things I try to do, is just realize that, like, sometimes the hope doesn't have to be a happy ending. Sometimes it just has to be that sense of possibility, sense of something maybe possibly that is better. And that sometimes is what gets you through.
For me, I think that the thing that only fiction can provide, that I try to achieve in my fiction, is justice. Justice justice exists in the real world, and it's important to fight for justice and to change injustice. But also, you can have a fucking fascist, misogynist in the White House, and no matter what happens, it's hard for me to see a scenario where there's like justice done, where the punishment that person gets is the punishment that I feel they deserve. So I think that fiction gives us a way to find justice, like a place where, okay, everyone's gonna suffer, but our suffering is gonna have meaning. If we are going through a really shitty, in real life, you go through shitty things all the time, and it is what it is, it sucks, but in fiction, you can make them have meaning and have a purpose and have a redemption in the sense of being able to come to terms with it and not be overwhelmed and broken by it. And also, one of the things that I found in my work as a community organizer is that, a lot of my friends are social workers, and it's a really interesting difference between being a social worker and being a community organizer. Not to say that either one is more important or better, but one thing that I find from my social worker friends, it's very easy to get burned out. People are trying to help people navigate a really broken system and get some sort of like redress or justice in a way that's really not set up for them to get any kind of help at all. And whereas community organizing is about trying to burn it all down and change the policies, and even if you don't have success, even if you're not making people's lives materially better, even if the social workers are helping people achieve concrete things, community organizing has this sort of like, I'm helping people see how to fight, and the fight is what is rewarding or transformative. So I try to help my characters in my stories, including this one, figure out how to fight even if they're not going to win or they're not going to win in this story.
So even though I feel hopeless a lot, all the time, often, one of the places I located the hope or sense of hope in my story, which is about rape culture, that's one of the things it's about, is in just the sense of good that can be done and release one can have just by talking about it and being able to talk about it. And the more people talk about it, the more of a set of experiences you have to kind of draw from and refer to and recognize exist in the world. And I think there are so many things that can happen to a person where previously, like it was sexual abuse or harassment or something, but you couldn't recognize it as such because you couldn't even speak of it, right? Like you couldn't, label it as such. And I think now, at least, I think people are more able to do so, and that is hope, and that is something good in and of itself. Although, I would like to transition to, people getting their asses kicked, figuratively or literally, but that can be for another story or another time.
I want to pivot, if I could, to a little bit to almost more of a writerly question, or a different kind of writerly question, I guess, because as people may have heard from even the parts that were read, the worlds of of each of your stories are on some level recognizably our own, close to our own, right? But that in each of the stories there is, I guess the term, there's a speculative element. In some cases it's something that at least for now is literally impossible, seemingly. And in other ways it's things that are more like, almost like predicting what might come to pass in a few years, right? Or a few months, who knows? But I wonder, as writers, how do you just do the world building that goes into deciding almost like how and when am I going to sort of warp reality enough for my story to sort of turn into something speculative in this story, but maybe even in general. Like, where's the line between the world we know and the world that you create, the world that you build, the world that you create, and how do you go about thinking about it and doing it?
I guess, so for me, it's very, I don't know, I always feel it out, and, that's easy, that's easy to do because I always write in like a very contemporary, sort of realistic vein, but then there's like a twist or something off or strange or surreal. And actually, I really admire people who do like intense, thought out, planned world building, like that is internally consistent or coherent. And maybe I'll try it one day and totally fail. But yeah, so for me, like a lot of the energy I get or I find in my writing is just kind of reacting to what I see as like the strangeness of contemporary life and heightening, some of those qualities or not.
Yeah, I think it's like the Coco Chanel advice where you like put all the things on that you want to put on and then you take everything off but one, which is kind of how I've found myself writing, but also because a lot of my writing these days is skewing more into horror, which is really funny because I'm terrified of everything. I wrote a zombie book because I was terrified of zombies. I wrote about, birth control being illegal because I have a daughter, and that's terrifying to me that she might grow up in a future where her body becomes, turns against her and it holds her prisoner of her potential. And so I find when I want to write about things that are terrifying, that it's easy not to clutter the world too much, not to ask the reader to do too many leaps of faith. So like when you're world building, you have to always, they always tell you, you have to have the reader suspend their disbelief. They have to be able to come along with the ride for you. And for me, I'm a very skeptical person. I'm a realist. I'm not an optimist at all. I always figure people are going to do the worst possible thing that they can do. So I'm rarely disappointed. And then I am, and then it's really upsetting for me. But so that was one of the things that when I especially in the short story, like, you have so little space to kind of do those big world movements in a short story that I wanted to not clutter it up too much for the reader. I wanted them to mostly be focused on the ideas that I was playing with in the narrative. So the world building is very much, like a more contemporary world like you're speaking to, because that's, to me, the world is not the important part in this piece. It's what happens when we let a few people make really bad decisions.
For me, the joy of speculative fiction, whether it's science fiction or fantasy or horror, is how you can just turn everything up so far of like, yeah, like I have the glasses in They Live where you can see all the monsters, but no one else sees the monsters, so I need to make people see the monsters. And so that's sort of my guiding principle when it comes to world building is what am I trying to say and what kind of world do I need to help say it? And I know they tell you that's like death to fiction is to have something to say of like about the world, but for me that's I think the starting place of all my stories is what am I trying to say? Who are the characters? What is the story? What is the world that's going to help me say it? And so if I want to say something about as I did with this story about sex as resistance, if I wanted to talk about my favorite Prince song, which is Little Red Corvette, and how do I imagine a world that's going to allow me to do that, and a future where sex is dangerous. I think Little Red Corvette is sort of impossible to sort of understand without understanding the early '80s and AIDS, and the idea that sex is a dangerous act, and so imagining a future where that is not that that's ever not true, but that is become true in a newly horrific way. And what's the technology that's going to go along with that? What's the shape of patriarchy in that future?
I'm interested, maybe just personally, but I find it always interesting. So to that end, did you know each of you? Did you know going in what was going to be the idea you were tackling, the point you wanted to make, for lack of a better term? I know that's too specific to me to be exactly the creative process, but did you sit down knowing like it's going to be contraception is illegal, it's going to be sex as resistance. It's going to be time travel. Did you know that part, or something else, or nothing? All the
It's all about nothingness. We are nihilists now. I actually started with one idea that I was playing with and ended on a completely different one, which might just be my terrible writing skills. We don't know. But that's usually how I find, like, I usually find that we start whenever, even in like a full-length novel, I find, like, you know, we always talk about that second act reversal, that second act twist. And I always find, like, the themes change when I hit that twist, because, you know, we've been talking about this one idea, and then all of a sudden you introduce something that still plays into that other idea, and now you're talking about something different. So, like, you know, really it starts with this idea of contraception and resistance and women's agency, and it kind of shifts into this idea of the responsibility we have as part of the social contract to actually resist and fight, and how much do you owe a society that has given you nothing in return. And it's mostly because at the time I was, you know, trying to, like, push the story out, like giving birth to a small child. The whole Not Your Mule and the Oscar So White was going on. If you guys aren't familiar with that, it was a social media kind of, what do they call it now? I mean, it's like they call it kerfluffle, but that kind of diminishes what it is. But it was this push by a black woman to kind of point out how white the Oscars were. And then after she started to gain some traction, there were a lot of other groups who were pushing back and were saying, well, yeah, but what about us? And so she kind of responded with saying, well, I'm here for black people because I'm a black woman, but why do I have to carry your causes, your banners as well, when you're not there to carry my banner? And so it became this other movement, which is kind of Not Your Mule. Because, you know, historically, black women have been, like, always told to show up for everybody else, and then there's nothing left for ourselves. So, you know, I did actually change, because as I was writing the story, I realized when we're talking about contraception and women's rights, there's also a point in that conversation where we have to talk about the role of black women supporting, you know, especially white women, but then not getting that support in return. So I think when you're talking about any idea, I think ideas evolve and change, you know, because people evolve and change. And I think it's for me, the stories I like the best are when you start out with one idea, and then by the time you get to the end, you're like, oh shit, they flipped the script on me and became something else.
And did you, so this is just, in the stories, then do you go back and sort of shuffle it, shade it, so it looks
Oh,
as though
yeah. Revision is like where I make my money. Like, there are no such thing as one draft. Like, some of these authors are out here like, I wrote one draft and it was brilliant. I was like, I don't know where you live, but it's not my house, because I don't live that life.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm not. I would love to have, like, an assistant. I don't have enough money for an assistant, of course, but, like, somebody who would just sit by me and tell me what I was thinking whenever I wrote something, so that I could remember. Because now I'm just like, damn, I did that. I don't really remember how, but it happened. I think that I did. So I was, you know, thinking about this prompt, and I was thinking about, you know, Me Too. I was thinking about all these stories that are, you know, coming out every day and still are. And then I was also thinking about the shitty media men list, and just sort of maybe just started writing. And first of all, like, I was like, this is a really bad, dumb idea, like a short story about the shitty media man list. Like, there's no way this can be good. And sometimes I think that's fun to do. So that also helped me, like, kind of get started. And I kind of just started with these friends talking, and you know, I was thinking more and more, like, what do we do with all of these stories, all of this information? What do we do with all of these, like, non-apologies? You know, what do we do when it's the same thing over and over again, but it feels different every time because it's, you know, bad in a different way, but still the same thing? And that's, I think, the conceit, the speculative conceit, which is like a time loop. That's where it grew out of that, because it's about repetition and bullshit and, like, figuring out what the point is.
Does everybody in the audience know about that, the media men list? Broadly, generally, some. So broadly speaking, with the idea, I guess, would be groups of women who work in media sharing among themselves lists of men who committed various sexual acts, stepping over various lines in ways that other women wanted to protect each other against, right? And it became a conversation among those women, but then somebody had to write about it, and then it became a news story, and then the woman who did it is being sued by one of the men on that media list, right? Just to sort of punctuate the point of that list. But just in case I didn't know, I had just, like, to my mind, it was absolutely a commonplace understanding, but I always feel like, does everybody know? I mean, I knew just because my wife was just like, oh, I got this list, but you can't come, don't come in this room for a few minutes. You can't look at this list. I'm like, okay. So that's how I found out about it.
That's what I said to my boyfriend, too.
Yeah.
You respected it.
Yeah. Well, what are you going to do? Yeah. Sam, how about you? You just said you already know ahead, but is that always the case? You know what the thing is you want to sort of talk about or point you want to make?
Usually I have like a lot of pieces of stories floating around in my brain, like some sort of Frankenstein laboratory of like many corpses that have been cut up into pieces and are just waiting for me to assemble into something horrible. So in this case, it was like, oh, that's a good torso. Like the letter, I got the letter, and I'm like, oh, that's a good torso. I know just what head will go on that torso.
That visual's awful.
And I'm sorry.
I just imagine you're like, which one shall it be today?
Yes.
I'm trying to get my mind around dystopian stories as a solution. Is this the land of counterpain? Is like reality is terrible, but it could be worse? I'm trying to understand how dystopian becomes a solution to bad reality.
So if you look at dystopian, there's always somebody who's loving that world, right? Like, a dystopian is only dystopian for the people on the bottom of the pile, right? Capitalism only sucks if you're part of the proletariat. If you're part of the upper class, it's awesome. You got a plane and you're a Kardashian and it's, life is good. So I think for me, looking at dystopian as a model for ways to resist, especially when you're coming from like a YA kind of sphere, it's really how we learn how to resist. It's how we learn to recognize how oppression functions and looks, and how to make those small changes in our lives that are going to make us be able to tolerate it.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that dystopia, while a handy marketing category or thing to say,
TM.
Is an oversimplification, and yeah, that's my perspective. Is that there's the right now life is a dystopia for a lot of people, and right now life is a utopia for a much smaller number, but still a lot of people. And so that's what reality is like, and being able to find the reason to keep living, the hope, the potential to change things and invert that is what in life, as in fiction, keeps me going.
I agree with all of the points that were made. And I also just want to add, I think, dystopia is just really valuable as a literary technique. In terms of just like, it's life, we get used to it, we don't see how like weird and fucked up or distinctive or whatever it truly is. And sometimes having that like strange mirror held up to it to defamiliarize the things that we think we already know about can be very enlightening.
Well, and to that end also, speaking from the editorial side, one of the things that was very interesting was to see the ways that so many of the stories essentially were saying like, things are bad, but not that they won't get this bad, but imagine if they got this bad. And then there's a number of the stories in there where they got this bad now, right? There's a story in the collection called The Wall by a writer named Liz Huerta. And that story is about children being kept in cages on the Mexican border, and governments sort of turning a blind eye to that or profiting off that. And when she submitted the story to us, we were just sort of like, she must have submitted it like early 2017 or mid 2017, and it was just sort of like, man, Liz, you really took it somewhere. And then it was like, oh no, you just took it right here. I see, you just took it to today is where you took it. And that, to me, like that, on the editorial end, again, what was kind of amazing about reading each story that came in was to see the ways that even the ones that are more fantastical, one of them has dragons in it. I promise you, even the one with dragons is not that far off, because the dragons are recruited as essentially a supplementary private police force to keep certain members of the American population in their prescribed ghettos so that the people with power don't in any way have to deal with them. And those people do something to work with to deal with those dragons. But the idea of like using them as a private police force, the dragons are fantastical, but I don't really think it's not unrealistic that private police forces will be manning borders between, I live in New York, between the Bronx and the Upper West Side in a few years. I wouldn't think it was impossible, right? So in that way, I think that the heart of the anthology was to sort of say dystopia, but within that is this hopeful thing, or this resistance thing, or just even to something that acknowledges you're not crazy for thinking this is happening, right? Because there's lots of outlets and people who will tell you that's not happening right up until you're dead.
I'm wondering if anyone on the panel has nonfiction reading that they particularly recommend to any of us.
Nonfiction. Yes.
Nonfiction is so depressing. I read recently a book. It's a giant-ass book, too, so if you love nonfiction, this is your jam. It's called The Half Has Never Been Told, and I keep blinking on the author, but it's literally about the legacy, the economic legacy of chattel slavery, and talking about, like, this is why we're such a great country, because we lived off the backs of a certain portion of the population for hundreds of years. And I think the reason it works is it's very meticulously researched, and it's not emotional. It's literally just this dude, like, and then we did this, and that sucked. And then we did this, and that also sucked. So it's kind of like, it's not like a dinner read, like you're gonna share anecdotes with your dinner guests, because it's very heavy. But I do think it's a great, especially when we start talking about who has a vested interest in seeing how systems progress. It's a great way to get us to that thinking space where we're like, okay, obviously someone's making money because things are this way. Where does the money go?
Yeah, I don't mess with nonfiction. It's my day job to like know about oppression and pay attention to it, and I want to go home and read about aliens and monsters. So I typically avoid it, but I did recently read The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, which is like the best science fiction novel I've read in a decade, and it's all real. So that is my one recommendation of it's miserably depressing, but it's really illuminating and brilliant in a lot of ways.
I think two books I've read recently that I think are very helpful and illuminating and just very well written and well made. And when it comes to just understanding this country right now, Evicted is one, and The New Jim Crow is the other. Yeah, they've been lauded, but they could be lauded more, and I think for good reason. The other thing I've been reading is completely off topic, but I've been really, I feel like it has to do with the mood I'm in, but I don't want to think about it or interrogate it too much, because I could just kind of find out all these weird things about myself. I've been reading a lot of books about deaths in national parks, but we don't need to go into that.
Did you say deaths in national parks?
Yeah, deaths in national parks.
You know what's funny? Because I was literally just watching a documentary about those people who were killed in Yosemite, like in the late 90s. And I was like, I wonder how many people have died in national parks. And now I know.
Oh my gosh.
It's apparently a lot.
It's a thing.
I have some recommendations for you.
Yes.
I would also add that I think it's Elizabeth Colbert, I don't know how to pronounce it, The Seventh Extinction, I think it's called, pretty great. And then I'm just going to be shameless about this. My wife is a writer named Emily Roboteau, and she wrote, you can find it online at the New York Review of Books website. She wrote an amazing essay about climate change that just ran on their website maybe a week or two ago. And it's about New York, but it's about the ways that one of the things that people often do with climate change is to say, so what's it going to be like in 2050 or 2030? And the point of her essay is to say, like, you're thinking way too far you're being way too optimistic to ask questions like that, to assume that New York will be here in 2050 as we understand it. And she basically travels to all the outer boroughs, particularly all the boroughs that are working class, Staten Island, the Bronx, parts of Brooklyn, that are either working class people of color, that will undoubtedly be the most heavily, and Wall Street, will no doubt be the most heavily affected by the rising sea levels. But because most of their constituents outside of Wall Street have no money and political power, nothing is being done to sort of shore up those territories or to protect or to create contingency plans for how those people will live in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. And so using that as a lens to talk about, like, whatever's done to them will eventually be done to you, but wouldn't it be nice if you cared about what was done to them first? So it's amazing. Her name's Emily Roboteau.
What's the name of the essay?
And it's called, Christ, you just...
Sorry.
I know I read it for copy edits, but I'm blank. But it's the only 40-page essay she's got on the New York Review of Books website. You just totally called me out on that.
So sorry.
When she hears this podcast, she's gonna kill me. But it is amazing, and it's also a photo essay as well. And so I know that's shameless, but that's one of the privileges of being married.
Because real life feels like a dystopia, was there any almost urge to go just completely hopeful in your writing, or hopeful in what you're consuming? Because that's kind of, over the past year, the route that I went, where I'm introducing more. A nonfiction book you could read is The Rational Optimist by Matt Ridley, which is nonfiction and it's not sad. I don't think he saw this presidency coming, but it was a good read, and it's really hopeful, and I spend more time paying attention. I have a brother that's a decade younger than I am. He's 21, and looking at his group of close friends and how diverse they are, I like to pay attention to that more so than the news and what I see on TV, because I'm watching this really beautiful friendship amongst this young, diverse group play out in real life rather than the news. So is there any compulsion to sometimes focus on hope rather than dystopia?
I think hope's different depending on where you sit. I mean, like, I'm a black woman in America, right? Like, my hope is not the same as my husband, who's a white dude, right? And in fact, we joke about it all the time. He's reading, I think it's Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility, and he's like, oh my God, these situations, and he's reading them out loud. I'm like, that's literally what happened to me last week at work that I talked to you about, right? Like, the weaponization of white women's tears. I'm like, how are you not paying attention to my stories? So I think when we say, like, things are hopeless, it really depends where you're sitting. Like Sam brought up the AIDS crisis in the early 80s. Like, that at one point was, like, the worst that it could get. And then, now we have, what is it, Truvia, which is they call it a prophylactic? Is that the right word? Prophylaxis? Truvada? Is that what it's? Truvada. Which, is actually, aimed at gay communities to try to, it's like a preemptive strike against HIV and AIDS. And so, that might seem hopeful to folks, but how about even more hopeful is just, being able to have a cure. So I think it depends, for me, hope is always dependent on where you sit. And I always believe in, I always believe it called the campfire rule. You leave your readers in a better place than you found them. So even though it feels bleak and the story feels awful, in my case, I always try to leave readers in a better place than when they started the story.
Yeah, for me in my fiction, it feels dishonest to be too hopeful and to be too happy, which I acknowledge is a problem. And so I want to honor, as a reader and as a writer, I often, if I'm watching a movie and it's just all happy, I don't feel a conflict. I don't really feel anything at the end. I can be happy, and happiness is important. But I want to go on a journey. I want to be told a story that's going to engage me, and that makes it all the more difficult, but also all the more important to reach a place of hope or justice or happiness. So I gotta have some I gotta have some misery in there, but hopefully we get through that and leave the reader in a better place.
Yeah, I think I really see, there is a lot of like the misery and hopelessness on this larger scale. I believe in individuals, or I believe in, individuals when I write them, or I want to believe that, people can be good to each other, specific people, not people in general, because I don't really believe that. And yeah, that's that for me.
I'd also say, like, the other nice thing about the idea of an anthology, I mean, there's 25 folks in there, so I would say there's at least a couple that come to mind immediately that are closer to what you're saying, almost like, did you ever read, there's a novel called Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel. And one of the things that I thought was so interesting about that book was it takes place in a post-apocalyptic world, but it's, I think, 5 years after or 10 years after the apocalypse. And there's just these great moments where people are like, remember when everyone was like eating each other and like killing everybody? Yeah, that was lousy. And then that's it. And because the point of that novel is about the rebuilding. It's not about what people went through. It's not about the day-to-day of like survival. It's about recreating life, right, to some degree. And so in its way, that's a hopeful book, but she doesn't pretend that bad period didn't happen. Right? It's just not the focus. And that the nice thing about the anthology is that there are some stories that are similarly like focused on, okay, even all of that has been conquered. Now what do we do to rebuild? And that's a source of hope, right, or potential hope. So again, speaking as the editor, it was kind of great to think of the book as a whole, as a sort of, it's a map of an entire, for Blackbirds, of a whole country, and in that way, no one place, all of the places can't feel the same, but you look at them together and it becomes a portrait of a nation in a particular time, and then maybe, 2, 3 years from now, 4 years from now, there's like People's Future Part number 2, and the snapshot of the country looks maybe, hopefully, somewhat different based on that time, right? And it's almost like the anthology becomes like a State of the Union kind of address. And I'm projecting far into the future, but just that idea of like, it's a snapshot of now, but it's definitely not any one thing. And all these stories, like within the stories, there are moments of humor, there are moments of pain, there's despondency, there's triumph. Like every single one of these stories does that when you read it, and so do many of the others, And also, I'm watching Russian Doll on Netflix, and if anybody it is an astoundingly optimistic show about people dying constantly, and so that's a thing I would throw out there outside of the anthology to check out. Okay, on that note, thank you all so much for coming out. I think we'll be going out there to sign anthologies if people would like. Thank you for coming out.